According to the International Labour Organization, about 1 in 10 of all youngsters globally are working. That's around 160 million children.
The world has evolved in countless ways, transforming societal norms and laws in the process. This video delves into 15 things that were once widely accepted but have undergone significant scrutiny or have been outright outlawed today. Without the frame of modern perspectives, these practices were considered normal or even essential. As we explore each, ponder the fluidity of human judgment and the ever-changing landscapes of legality and morality. Number 1. Public smoking. Public smoking was once a widespread practice, as deeply ingrained in the social fabric as gathering around the radio or attending a Sunday church service. In the early to mid-20th century, smoking was not only socially acceptable, but often encouraged. Even doctors endorsed certain brands of cigarettes, appearing in advertisements that claimed smoking could aid in digestion, relieve stress, or even promote lung health. Walking down the street into restaurants or through airports, it was common to be greeted by a cloud of tobacco smoke. Public transportation systems, including buses and airplanes, had designated smoking sections, sometimes merely marked by a sign or a curtain. Today, public smoking has been dramatically curtailed or even banned entirely in many parts of the world. Cities have designated smoke-free areas, and even outdoor spaces like parks and beaches often prohibit smoking. The world has come a long way in understanding the public health implications of smoking. What was once an everyday activity, performed with little thought of consequence, is now recognized as a significant public health concern. A transformation reflecting not only advances in medical understanding, but also shifts in social values and norms. Number 2. Open containers of alcohol in cars. It's difficult for many people today to imagine a time when driving with an open container of alcohol in a car wasn't just legal, but was also a widely accepted practice. In a bygone era, it wasn't uncommon for drivers to have a beer can or a bottle of whiskey beside them as they cruised down the road. There were no cup holders specifically designed for lattes or energy drinks. Instead, those compartments were often the resting places for cans of beer or small flasks. Adults who remember these times might even recall how their parents would drive while sipping on an alcoholic beverage, with little concern for the legality or the potential risks involved. This relaxed attitude towards drinking and driving wasn't solely due to cultural factors, but also stemmed from a lack of comprehensive legislation regulating the practice. Many jurisdictions didn't have specific laws against having an open container of alcohol in a moving vehicle. Even when some states or local governments started introducing open container laws, enforcement was often lax, and the penalties were usually minor, such as a small fine. Today, most Western countries have strict laws against having an open container of alcohol in a vehicle. Not only is the driver subject to legal penalties, but passengers can also be fined for possessing an open container. While there are limited exceptions, like limousines or party buses in some jurisdictions, the general rule is clear and strictly enforced. The days when it was socially and legally acceptable to have an open alcoholic beverage while driving are, for the most part, a relic of the past, indicative of how much society's understanding and regulation of risky behaviors have evolved. Number 3. Dueling. The concept of settling disputes through dueling is one that might seem archaic or romanticized, often associated more with period dramas or historical novels than with any aspect of modern life. Yet, there was a time when dueling was an accepted, even respected method for resolving conflicts and defending one's honor. Originating in medieval Europe, this practice found its way across the Atlantic and was popular in the United States, particularly among the southern and military classes, up until the 19th century. The basic premise was simple. Two individuals would face off in a controlled setting, and through a series of prescribed actions, often involving pistols or swords, attempt to settle a dispute that had been deemed unresolvable by other means. Far from being clandestine affairs, duels were social spectacles. They were witnessed by select gatherings, and the rules, often known as the code duello, were carefully outlined to ensure a fair fight. Participants would choose seconds, friends or allies who would not only serve as armed backup, but also as arbiters of the duel's rules. Of course, the ultimate aim was not always to kill one's opponent, but to demonstrate courage and a willingness to risk life for honor. This might explain why some duels ended in deliberate misfires or superficial wounds that were enough to satisfy honor without causing serious harm. Today, the concept of dueling seems largely anachronistic, a curiosity of history that has little relevance to how disputes are settled in contemporary society. It serves as a stark example of how cultural norms and legal structures evolve over time, often pushing out practices that were once thought to be essential elements of social interaction. Number 4. Child labor. The image of children heading to factories instead of schools may strike us as grotesque today, but this was a widespread reality in many parts of the world until the early 20th century. During the Industrial Revolution and well into the early 1900s, child labor was a common practice. Children, some as young as 5 or 6, were employed in various industries, including textiles, coal mines, and even construction. They were attractive to employers not just because they could be paid less, but also because their small size allowed them to perform tasks that adults couldn't, such as crawling through narrow tunnels in mines. While some activists and philanthropists raised concerns about child labor as early as the 19th century, it took significant time for societal attitudes to change and for legislation to catch up. Laws were eventually passed, first in Europe and later in the United States, to set minimum age requirements for employment and to regulate working conditions for minors. These reforms were driven by a mix of humanitarian concerns, labor movements, and a growing understanding of children's developmental needs. Society began to see childhood as a distinct phase of life that should be dedicated to education and personal growth rather than labor. Today, child labor is largely considered unacceptable and illegal in most developed nations, although it still persists in some parts of the developing world. The shift away from the practice is a testament to changes in both societal values and legal frameworks, illustrating how norms can evolve dramatically over relatively short periods of history. Number 5. No seatbelts in cars. It's hard to fathom now, but there was a time when cars were manufactured without seatbelts, let alone airbags or other safety features we take for granted today. When automobiles first came into mass production, they were considered a luxury, and little thought was given to the safety of the passengers or the driver. Speeds were lower and roads were less crowded, but that didn't necessarily make driving less hazardous. Cars were often unstable, brakes were unreliable, and of course there were no seatbelts to protect occupants in the event of a collision. The lack of this simple safety measure wasn't due to oversight, but was rather a reflection of the era's understanding, or lack thereof, of vehicular safety. Cars were a symbol of freedom and adventure, and the potential dangers seemed secondary to the exhilaration of the open road. Early car advertisements focused on power, style, and the joy of the driving experience, conspicuously omitting any discussion of safety. It was a time of optimism and faith in technological progress, where the risks were downplayed or ignored entirely. Nowadays, driving without a seatbelt is not only considered reckless, but is also illegal in many parts of the world. Seatbelts have been proven to save lives, significantly reducing the risk of fatality and accidents. This change didn't happen overnight, but was the result of decades of research, advocacy, and incremental improvements in legislation. The transition from seatbelt-free cars to the stringent safety regulations of today provides a compelling example of how society's attitudes and laws can evolve in response to new information and changing conditions. Number 9. Asbestos usage. Asbestos, a naturally occurring mineral, was once hailed as a miracle material for its remarkable properties. It was fire-resistant, durable, and cheap, making it an ideal component in a variety of applications, from construction materials like roofing and insulation to household products such as oven mitts and ironing board covers. During the 20th century, especially after World War II, the use of asbestos surged, finding its way into homes, schools, and workplaces. The material was so prevalent that it became synonymous with safety and reliability, offering a level of fire protection that was unparalleled by other substances at the time. Today, asbestos is largely seen as a hazardous material that requires careful handling and disposal. Many buildings constructed before the 1980s are undergoing asbestos abatement to remove or encapsulate the dangerous fibers. Lawsuits related to asbestos exposure have led to multi-billion-dollar settlements, serving as cautionary tales for industries that neglect public health in the pursuit of profit. The story of asbestos is a vivid example of how something once seen as beneficial can turn out to be extraordinarily harmful, prompting significant changes in both public policy and popular perception. Number 10. No animal rights. In earlier times, the concept of animal rights as we understand it today was virtually non-existent. Animals were largely seen as commodities, resources to be used for various human needs such as food, labor, and entertainment. While some cultures and individuals may have treated animals with a level of respect or kindness, this was more an exception than a rule. There was no overarching ethical or legal framework that protected animals from abuse or exploitation. Practices that are now considered inhumane, such as animal testing without anesthesia or using animals in brutal forms of entertainment like bear baiting and cockfighting, were commonplace and socially accepted. Over the past few decades, however, there has been a seismic shift in the way society views the treatment of animals. Fueled by scientific research into animal cognition and emotion, advocacy work, and public awareness campaigns, many countries have established laws that aim to protect animals from overt abuse and ensure better living conditions. Although there is still much work to be done, practices like cosmetic testing on animals and the use of animals in circuses have been banned or restricted in various parts of the world. Today, the idea of animal rights has gained enough traction to be considered a social and ethical obligation, rather than a mere afterthought. Organizations devoted to animal welfare have proliferated, and the topic itself has become a significant part of public discourse. This transformative change in attitudes toward animal welfare illustrates society's capacity for ethical growth and underscores the evolving understanding of the interdependent relationship between humans and the rest of the animal kingdom. Number 11. No building codes. In the past, the concept of building codes, as we understand them today, was largely absent. The construction of buildings, homes, and other structures was an endeavor guided more by traditional knowledge, immediate need, and available resources than by any structured set of safety standards or guidelines. The absence of building codes often meant that structures were erected quickly but not necessarily safely, leading to a wide variance in the quality and longevity of buildings. While some stood the test of time, others became infamous for their structural failures, sometimes with devastating consequences. The need for comprehensive building codes became increasingly apparent as societies grew more complex and as advances in materials, science, and engineering made more ambitious constructions possible. Major disasters like fires or building collapses that resulted in loss of life and property served as painful catalysts for change. Gradually, governments began to recognize the necessity of standardizing construction practices, not just for the safety of occupants, but also for the general well-being of the community. This led to the formulation and enforcement of building codes that covered everything from structural integrity to fire safety and sanitation. Today, building codes are integral to the construction industry, enforced by law, and often subject to rigorous inspections. They influence almost every aspect of building design and construction, serving to protect both the people who will use the buildings and the workers who construct them. While they may seem cumbersome or restrictive at times, these codes have undoubtedly saved lives and made our built environment more secure, accessible, and sustainable. Number 12. Harsh penal systems. In early times, the penal systems in place in many societies were remarkably harsh and often brutal, operating on principles very different from modern ideas about rehabilitation and humane treatment. Punishments were usually geared more towards retribution and public humiliation rather than any form of correction or social reintegration. Physical punishments like flogging, branding, and even mutilation were common forms of justice. In some cases, offenders were placed in stocks or pillories in public squares, subjected not just to the elements but also to the scorn, ridicule, and abuse of passers-by. Over the centuries, evolving social, ethical, and psychological understandings have greatly altered the landscape of criminal justice. Today, while the systems are far from perfect, there is at least an institutional acknowledgement of the need for humane treatment and the possibility of rehabilitation. Physical torture and public executions are widely regarded as inhumane and are outlawed in most countries. The shift from a focus on pure punishment to one of rehabilitation and reintegration reflects not just changes in law, but also a broader evolution in societal attitudes about justice, ethics, and the nature of human behavior. Number 13, lax food safety regulation. In earlier eras, food safety was a concept more honored in the breach than in the observance. The absence of any comprehensive regulatory framework meant that consumers were often exposed to foods that were contaminated, adulterated, or otherwise unfit for consumption. The methods used in food production and storage were frequently primitive by today's standards, leading to a high risk of spoilage and contamination. There were no expiration dates, ingredient lists, or nutritional information to guide consumers. Nor were there any standardized procedures for inspecting food items, meaning that meat, dairy, and other perishables could be sold even if they were tainted or spoiled. Today, food safety standards are stringent and enforced by a combination of local, state, and federal agencies. Advances in science and technology have made it possible to test for a wide range of contaminants, from bacteria to chemical additives. Food labeling has also become more transparent, allowing consumers to make informed choices. While food safety issues still exist, they are the exception rather than the rule, and there are mechanisms in place for swift recalls and public advisories. The transformation in food safety regulations is a testament to societal progress in recognizing and upholding public health as a paramount concern. Number 14, racial segregation. One of the most egregious practices allowed in earlier times was racial segregation, a system that institutionalized racial discrimination by separating people based on race. Although the most widely recognized form of this was the Jim Crow laws in the United States, which lasted from the late 19th century until the mid-20th century, various forms of racial segregation have been practiced globally. These systems were not merely cultural practices, they were codified in law and enforced by the state. They relegated people of certain races to inferior schools, hospitals, transportation, and public facilities, among other social amenities. Over time, mass movements, legal challenges, and international pressure have helped dismantle formal systems of racial segregation. Landmark decisions like Brown v. Board of Education in the United States and the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa signaled seismic shifts in social policy. However, the legacies of these systems continue to perpetuate racial disparities and social divides. Although we live in an era where racial segregation is largely denounced, understanding this dark chapter is crucial. It serves as a stark reminder of how laws and policies can be used to institutionalize inequality, urging us to remain vigilant in combating systemic discrimination. Number 15, untaxed income and loopholes. In earlier times, income taxation was a far less regulated affair than it is today, full of gaps that allowed considerable room for untaxed income and loopholes. Tax codes were often poorly defined, inconsistently enforced, and rife with opportunities for avoidance or even evasion. For much of history, taxation was a patchwork of levies, tariffs, and duties rather than a standardized system. Wealthy individuals and companies with the resources to hire skilled accountants or to influence legislation frequently exploited these ambiguities to minimize their tax liabilities or avoid taxes altogether. It was not uncommon for income to go unreported, especially from sources that were less easily traceable, such as cash transactions, bartering, or informal business arrangements. The lack of international cooperation and oversight also made it easier for individuals and corporations to move assets across borders to tax havens, countries that offered low or zero taxation. Tax authorities had limited capacity to track such movements or to assess the true extent of an individual's or a corporation's earnings and holdings. Today, while some level of tax avoidance and planning still exists, the system is far more transparent and equitable than before. Many countries have implemented progressive taxation, closing loopholes that disproportionately benefit the wealthy. Additionally, international agreements aim to combat tax evasion on a global scale. While no system is perfect, the evolution of tax regulation demonstrates a societal shift toward greater fairness and equity in how public funds are collected. pointing toward a growing acknowledgement of the role that taxation plays in reducing income inequality and funding public services.